Welcome to Yobit Solutions. This video is a part of the series regarding managing your finances using Excel. This is segment number 7. In segment number 6, we covered the template design work of a ledger account on our application. And on the video number 5, we covered the same but for a journal account. Both links to the journal work and the ledger account work is in the description below, and it's highly recommended that you watch those videos first if you haven't watched them before you continue on to the current video, because a lot of work that we do now is an extension of the principles that we established in the previous work. In the current segment, we will work on a summary sheet where we will dynamically be combining all the ledgers and the journal accounts in the file into a trial balance information, which can then further be used to develop the financial statements. And in the process, you'll also see that we work on an intermediate sheet data design, which is where we would keep the data of all the Excel sheet used in the file, especially the ledger and the journal accounts. And in order to do that dynamically, you'll see that we'll be working on a small Visual Basic script, which would be an optional, only if you want to cover the stuff dynamically. Otherwise, you can just manually put in those ledger account information by yourself, and then you do not have to use a macro-enabled Excel file. We jump into Excel and start developing the solution for the current file. One humble request: if you like the content that has been provided to you, kindly consider subscribing to the channel and like this video. It will immensely help us. At the same time, we'll make sure that you get informed on time whenever a new video is uploaded to the solution. So continuing on to the current segment, let's first define the basic criteria that we require before we develop the Visual Basic macro. The requirement here is that we need to get a list of all the journals and the ledger accounts used in the file, because each journal will represent a sheet, and so goes for the ledger accounts. Now the challenge is, however, that there's no easy method exists. So there's no easy Excel formula that you can use to fetch all these sheet names in a range. So in order to accomplish that, there are a couple of solutions available. The first one is the Visual Basic, as we discussed just a moment ago, that this can be used, and Visual Basic is the approach all the way from past to, which is good for today as well. But the limitation is that this solution will only work on your desktop version on Windows or on Mac. If you use the solution on the Excel 360 on the web, the Visual Basic code will not work. So then you have no choice but to manually update them. Or other choice is that we develop an Office script, which is the present and the future work of the Microsoft on the Office applications. But there are challenges there, that the scripts, the Office scripts are not as easy to implement, because you have to download some add-ins, and then there's a development life cycle also that goes along from our end to upload the script to the App Store. So within the scope of the current video, we're not going to cover this, but I just laid them out so you know that other future solution is that exists that we will intend to cover down the road in future, but not in the current video. The third choice here is to go manual, which means that you just ignore the Visual Basic if you're using Excel 360. Just update the Excel sheet whenever you change, rename, remove, or add a ledger or a journal account. So let's cover the Visual Basic design on what does it do for our desktop applications. Here's a simple flow chart. The goal here is not to teach you Visual Basic, it's just to make sure that you understand what exactly the macro is trying to do. On the left hand side, you get two events. Events are that the Excel execute your function whenever the two things change. The things change are the events that we have listed here, is the sheet activated or the selection change, because there's no quick way of determining if you added a new journal or ledger account, but you'll activate the sheet and it will capture the event. So if any of these two things happen, the function will be called, and in the function we'll read the sheet names, and then we will compare with our existing temporary variable to make sure that we only go further if the sheet names have been changed, because you can activate and deactivate sheet for a couple of other reasons as well. So if the sheet data change, and then we will update our sheet data Excel file. Go through the actual macro code for this Visual Basic macro. These two events, the sheet activated and the sheet selection change, are defined up in here. Every time these events happens, they call the subfunction called update sheets, and that is defined in here. And in the update sheets subfunction, it calls another subfunction to read the current sheet data at that time, and which is this subfunction here. It's pretty straightforward. It's just a for loop to go through, iterate through all the sheet names and store the names inside an array and return it to this subfunction. Once it reads the data, it compares with the previous stored information. Only if the sheet names data changed, it goes back and update the sheet, Excel sheet, which is sheet data, in the cell C2 and update the new sheet names in here. And we can see that this is the sheet data here, and C2, this is the cell. So this is where the macro will dump the latest sheet's name, and we can check it. If we go back and let's just say we went into the ledger 1 account, let's just rename this Excel sheet, say bank. And if we ledger 1 is a bank account and we go back into the sheet, you can see that the account name is changed in the sheet data here. Okay, so now so the important note here is if you use the web version only, that means you don't have the access to the macro. Please make sure that once you enter your sheet names manually, you put a question mark on the last cell, because that way system knows that this is where it should stop when it goes through the data in these subsequent rows. Other important thing, if you're manually entering any data, you only have to add the sheets which are either ledger or journal, because everything else is we're getting filtered down to these 4 sheets anyway. So for the manual work, to make it easy, only list down your ledger and journal accounts in here and put a question mark at the end. You should be all set. So let's walk through what else happens once the macro records the sheet data. The row number 4 is basically just filtering down all the Excel sheet data that exists before the question mark, and hence the importance of the question mark in the row number 2. Once that is done, then we go inside each of these sheets and try to read a variable named sheet type. And if you recall from the previous video, in our ledgers and journal accounts, we define this parameter in the column A and the value in the column B for what kind of sheet this function has. Like for example, this is a sheet type which is a ledger, and for the journal it would be sheet type of a journal. So in row number 5, we are pulling up this parameter try to pull up this parameter from every sheet, and then we filter down that list to only include those sheet names from the row number 4 where the sheet type is either a ledger or a journal. So that means these 4 sheets. So once that is filtered down with the formula on row number 6, then we go in each of these 4 sheet names and fetch the location of these columns. Again, recall from our previous videos, ledger and journal, both of these accounts, we have defined the location of the key columns in our data table to record in which with the address of this information, and we fetch them in here. So that is in a nutshell is the purpose of this intermediate sheet. And let's go through these formulas, how we are fetching these details. Okay, let's work on our formulas. I'm gonna erase everything so we can build it from the scratch. The first thing we need to do is find the location of the question mark in the row number 2 where the macro dumps our Excel sheets. And that can be done using function xmatch, and we are looking for question mark, and for the array size we need to select sufficient number of columns so that that will cover most of our needs. I would say just maybe like a easy, that will give you good close to 150 columns as an estimate. So if this is our array, and then it tells you that the question mark here is in column number 11. Now once we know that, now we can convert this number to a column vector that can then be used to fetch up the index of these elements. And that can be done by including this function inside a sequence. And the sequence we start with the number 1, and then the end number would be the result of the previous function, but we have to subtract 1 because we do not want the question mark in our results. That way we covered it fetch up all the index numbers, and that will be our column vector. And now what we can do is we can put all this result inside our index function, and that requires the array again, and that array can still be the same, which we previously defined as EZ, and that is our array. And we just need the row number has to be only the first row of that array, and the number column you can define the vector that we just established, going at the end and close the function. Now we get the sheet names, so that takes care of it. Let us find the row number 5 data, which is the sheet type property to be fetched on all of these sheet here. The formula is pretty simple, because if you remember, in our ledger and the journal accounts, we define these properties in column A and column B for both journal and the ledgers, and that's what exactly we are trying to fetch here. And I mean, a formula would be pretty simple. As an XLOOKUP function, we are looking up for sheet type property in our, let's say in this particular account, look into the column A, and once you find it, give us the corresponding value from the column B, and that's a simple formula here. Let's convert this formula to a dynamic, because a dynamic array here, so we can fetch this detail from all of the elements in this array. Other thing you can keep in mind that these values are the text values, which means we have to convert them in using the indirect function. So let's combine everything together here as a mapping function. The array is this is our array, and lambda function. Let's name the parameter as a sheet, and here we can define our XLOOKUP function. We are looking up for sheet type information. Now where are we looking up here? This is where we have to inject the indirect function, because it's a text value. Other thing we have to do is, whenever you define the sheet name in a text, it's advisable to enclose that name inside the single quotes, because sometimes if you have some character in the sheet names, and that can throw up an error, like certain characters are not allowed directly. So that means we should concate this information with a single quote, and then the sheet would be the sheet name at that instance, and then add. Now let's end our single quote, and also at the same time we define our range with an exclamation A separator A, and that is our column A range. So all of this defines our sheet information. And let's just copy this portion, and once it's found, we get the corresponding value from the B column, and we can convert this A to B here. Now if it's not found, because this information will not be there in the non-ledger or journal accounts, and we can say just give us some default value rather than throwing up an error if you cannot find this. And then let's just close the lambda function, map function. There we go. So it find all these properties, and you can see that this is where we are interested in, because we are only interested in ledger and the journal accounts. That we will get them filtered down in here. So we can say filter this array. And what is our condition? Condition is that the corresponding value has to be either ledger or journal, the two conditions. Whenever you have to put a two or conditions, the Excel required them to be put inside the parentheses. The first condition would be this array equals to journal, and we can fetch it dynamically here from our journal, right? That's the first condition. And the second condition would be same, except we will put as a ledger. Let me just copy it again. Instead of 17, we can just so either journal or ledger. Okay, so that includes our function here. So I'm sorry, it has to be added with a plus sign. It's kind of weird way. So you have to, whenever you have multiple OR conditions, you define every condition in the parenthesis, but then put a plus sign in here. Now, if you have to do the multiple AND, then you multiply them. So that's the trick here. Okay, so that has been done. So now you can see that we isolated our information into these 4 sheets because these are the 4 ledger and the journal accounts that we need. Now, this information here is exactly the same what we, instead of finding a sheet type, now we are trying to find out the address of these columns that has been defined against these properties in our ledger and the journal accounts. So we want this information to be pasted here, and then we would also put our sheet names in the front so that it would be easier in our summary sheet to manage this. So let us do that. So let us complete our account information. We can just copy the same formula from here over to this range. Now, 2 things we want to make sure that we change the parameter into the account. You can change that by click and dragging. Now, other thing is, let's remove the absolute information out from our row because we will be dragging it down. So we want to make sure when we drag the formula down, account changes to queue status and so on and so forth. At the same time, the range should stay where it is. That means we can press F4 to convert this parameter into absolute reference. So that is the result we get. Now let's modify this such that the answer also prefix the sheet name in front of it. And there's many ways you can do it. One method is inside of our lambda, let's redefine the sheet parameter by putting a let statement in the beginning. That sheet would be as a function of s. And that can be done by, let's single quote and s, which would be the sheet name. Then another and would be end quote and the sign of exclamation, which is what's needed for the range. So once that's done, we just redefine our sheet by doing this extra work, and we will append the sheet result in front of our XLOOKUP function. Now, other thing is, because we modified the sheet here, there's no need to redo this again inside our indirect function because sheet already contained this data in it. So all we have to do is remove the quote and the exclamation sign from our indirect functions, and that should take care of it. Finally, we have to put a close bracket to the let statement. That should take care of the information. Let's click and drag this to the downstream and make sure all the functions are done. That take care of all the work that needed to be done on our intermediate sheet. Let's save the file and start working on our summary sheet. So let's start working on our template for our summary sheet here. I took the liberty of taking some self-explanatory item placed on the sheet already to save the time. We can quickly go through them, what these values are, and they should make sense. The first idea here is that this is the area we exactly are getting a reference from this work that we just completed. So these are just the associative copies and referring back to the sheet data. On the top row here is I created a sequence and which will just contain an index-based number for each ledger or the journal account that exists in the file, and this will be used in the formulas downstream when we start working on these areas. Coming on the left-hand side of the paper of the sheet type is this sheet type is a design. Then there's an AR and AP. This is for pending entries. For the scope of within the scope of this video's work, please ignore and assume this value will always remain false. And when we work on the future video, when we actually do the pending accounts, auto accounts receivable and auto accounts payable work, and that's where this area would be used, and same goes for this area. The goal here is once we finish this our summary sheet, We will design this sheet in such a way that we will make an exact copy of this sheet into a second sheet here. And so that will save us time. But on the second sheet, we will change this value to true and make some changes accordingly. Again, let's just wait because these things will only make sense when we get to that point. For now, assume it always to be false. Then we come to the status. Status entries are what we need to sum up as an if condition when we put all of our T accounts in here, and we only need to sum up the data from these Excel sheet where the status is either complete or pending. And you can recall the meaning of these entries from our previous video when we worked on our ledger and journal accounts. Here, the green entries are the manual, the blue entries are basically the sheet data. And as you add more account, this idea that this sheets will grow in this direction automatically. Let's go through these two mini tables. This table here is only for the sales tax receivable and sales tax payable. This is where we would put those two accounts in here, and that area will fetch the information from all the Excel sheet on their tax column. A positive entry will go into sales tax accounts payable, and a negative entry will go into sales tax account receivables. And because we're going to be pulling them up using a formula and an if condition for negative and the positive number, that's why you see those two signs that we will be using as a filter when we fetch the data using various formulas in here. So that's how these two rows will be consumed. This is where the T accounts name will come, their corresponding IDs and their corresponding primary ID, which we will fetch from our design sheet as we did in our ledger and the journal design. This area here will be for rest of the account that are used on our ledger and journal from our accounts tables. And that's the plan here. So let's start filling up this information. Let's get the T accounts equals to our dynamic array that we have already established here. Select the first cell of the range and make sure you put a pound sign, the number sign at the end to make sure the whole range is copied. Once that is done, now we need the IDs of these accounts, and that will be done using XLOOKUP function. We are looking up for this account in our T accounts array, because that's a full name. Look for the given account in our T accounts table, and once it's located, give us the corresponding value from our ID account. And like, for example, this pick to 105. Now if we go back and put a number sign at the end of the first parameter, this becomes an array function. It pulls up all the T accounts information. Now let's do the same thing, but for the primary ID. Let's go back and change ID to PID. Okay, so that's done, and now let's put up we need an index number against each of these accounts, similar to what's done in here. These index will be used in these formulas when we develop them later part of this video. Sequence and number of rows is the rows formula of this range, and we just need a one column. So it's a one base index, so whenever the account number changes, and this number will always remain updated. So that is our index entry. Now let's do the same thing here, or one more thing. We also need the debit account here, and that we can simply copy the same formula here that we just copied. And instead of a PID, we can put the debit. Sorry for the typo. So we picked up the debit account. Now one change I do want to make in here is that I want to put the debit condition as an if statement, which will be helpful when this is the future work we're doing in advance. That means if this value had been true, then we need the credit column in here, and we'll update that later when we get to it. and that would be you can say if as the last parameter we'll just put an if statement which will say if this is true, give us the credit entry instead of a debit. Change the debit to the credit, and we need to complete the if bracket. So this is still a debit for the scope of this work, but once we in future if we go there, we will convert this into the credit, and in fact these values would then becomes credit, and we'll address that later when we get to it. So that sets up our preliminary work on the T accounts. Let's finish these two again, because these one where we have to specify the accounts receivable and accounts payable for the sales tax. I mean, you do not want to copy them here because this list is a sorted list. So in future, if you change the account name, our account name here would be messed up. So the better idea would be, because we already know that there will always be two accounts in here, we can just copy the IDs from here. So like for example, our accounts receivable for the sales tax is 107. We can just hard type 107, and similarly 111 is for our accounts payable for the sales tax. And here now we can do the same thing, but pull up the accounts name using XLOOKUP function instead. So that way we're not dependent upon a sorted list. And then that would be XLOOKUP, and you can just look up from here actually, or you can go back into the design and run the same thing. We are looking up for our ID, and ID in our lookup array again is the ID column in here, which is this column. And once it's located, give us the corresponding account full name in this case here. We're just going in the opposite direction. Look for the XLOOKUP. We need to put table entry. I'm sorry. It's just I messed up using full name. So we're looking for the ID and giving us the corresponding full name. Yeah, sorry for the typos in here. And what we can do here, if we put a number sign at the end, it will make it an array, and both entries will be covered. Sorry, we cannot do that because it's not dynamic. We'll just have to drag it down. So that's what becomes our accounts payable and accounts receivable. Now these two, this is still the same, and we can just do a copy and paste in here, and that will copy our sales tax information. And same can go, we can just use the copy function formula here and paste it, and then drag it down. One thing we did not do is B60 would have been absolute reference, and that's what the that's where whenever we drag the formulas, we got to make sure that the correct cells are with absolute reference, because otherwise it creates a mess here. Okay, so this is done. One more thing here, we need a sequence now. Sequence, we need 2 rows, 1 column, and just a default 1 and 2. And the reason why we did this that way, because we want to keep it still dynamic, so these formulas will be updated in a better way. So that sets up our initial work in our account range. Let us work on getting the total function done. This is by far the most complex function that we would create for this Excel file. On the row side, we have all the various accounts, and the column side, we have all the various journal and ledger sheets, and we know the index of these sheets and also the index location for each of these accounts. And what we're trying to accomplish here is that in every journal or ledger sheet, we need to find the total for a given account where the status is either complete or pending. To better understand that, this is a snapshot of a table out of our journal or ledger account. What we need to find out, this is our account range, this is our status range, and this is our total range. And an Excel gives you a formula where you can find the sum from our total range depending upon when a given account exists in the account range and the given status option, which is a complete or pending inside our status range. So that means one more criteria, because one of the filter, the status, is itself an array, and if that's the case, then Excel return this function in the form of an array for each entry option for the status. In this case, it would be 2 elements array. So that means we have to do a sum enclosed on top of that function to make sure we get a one final number. So that takes care of it. So how do we go through each sheet and each account? We will make use of another function called makeArray. And how does makeArray works? It has 3 parameters. The first and second parameters are the integers, so how many rows and how many columns you have. And then it goes through a function where rows and column at a given instance will be provided, and you need to tell the system what to do with that. For example, if you have a 4 rows and 3 columns array, and then you define a function where you're just adding row plus column as a one output number, it's a pretty straightforward. That's how the function will rotate. For each row, and it will find the current row and current column, and in this case, we're only doing an addition. So how do we expand that function for our need? Is basically we will do a make array function. We have the number of accounts and we have a number of Excel sheet, and then we do the lambda function. And in the lambda function, you would know the current row and the current column index. And then this is where we will inject the SUMIF function that we just reviewed in the previous sheet. So that in a nutshell is the function that we're trying to accomplish. And let's go one step further, because the only input you know is the index of account and the index of the sheet. And from the index of the row, we find the current account. And from the index of the column from the sheet, we need to find out the total range, account range, and the status range. And the status option is basically the current and approved and the pending. And finally, once all these parameters are calculated from the current row index and the column index, we inject the SUMIF function. So let's complete this function here. I just copied the same image as an easy cheat sheet here. And let me select, this is the cell where we will put the formula in. And that is our formula that I just copied over. Let's go through quickly. It's a make array. Number of rows is the number of accounts in this account. Number of columns are number of the sheets, and you can pick any of these sheets because it's the count of the rows. And in this case, it's a Q6 is what I picked. And then lambda function R and C. And now the let statement is where we define all the ranges from the R or C parameters. First one is the account against the rth row from accounts column. And then the total range come from Q10, which is in fact here, it's going to be total or gross based upon which account we use. But for now, just focus on the used is the where the total is given. And then the filter account goes to Q4. Q4 is where we define our total account filter accounts, and the status goes on row number 6 on that account in here. And finally is our SUMIF functions, and we are just enclosing all these ranges information inside the indirect for the total range, account range, and the status. And finally, the last parameter here is the two status filled status array, the status option, shall I say. And doing all of that, when you press enter, it completes the formula for all the accounts in all the sheets, and that's exactly what we are looking for. So let's work on the tax sum. The formula is very much similar to what we just finished here with a slight modification, and the modifications are explained here. All we need to make sure is that we separate out the sum positive numbers and negative numbers separately. The positive number goes to the tax payable account, the negative number goes to the tax receivable account, but we need to convert them to positive number because we're just switching the account. And the formula here is almost the same. The only changes here is the number one change here is instead of the total range, now we need to go to the tax range, the column where the taxes are added. And then on addition, we have to put an additional absolute function that will convert the negative and positive numbers to the same positive numbers. But we put an additional filter in here that we filter down the tax range to the either positive or the negative by using the filter that we have already established here. So if you so that would be the additional filter. And once I paste the formula here, let me paste it up, and you can see that this formula here is exactly the same, except now you have a tax range instead of the total range, and then you have a status range goes in here. These are our the rows and the column sequence, and then at the same time, this is the last filter where the first account will only consider the negative values, and the second account will only consider the positive values, and it will sum it up. And if I press enter, it should take care of it. Great. So that takes care of our calculations. So so far we have updated all these total amounts, and now what we need to do is sum up all the rows in a total column here, and then convert the net total into either debit or in credit, depending upon what kind of account that is. And then finally we do with the trial balance in here, and that's something we will accomplish in our next video. And in addition, we will also complete the key pending, the auto pending status transaction sheet as well. And we're getting close, but that's it for this segment of the video. I really appreciate you taking time and going through it. And last but not the least, I would appreciate if you consider liking and subscribing to this channel. If you haven't done so, I would greatly appreciate it. Good luck in your financial journey, and see you next time.